Never in the history of slavery has there been a better time than right now for you to educate your children at home. Hi, welcome to the channel. I think the cat is going to be very annoying today. I don't know why he's so needy, let's say. Anyway, we're going to continue what we started last week, which was looking at the subject of slavery. And I'm going to read you a passage from the book of Exodus, which is the second book of the Bible. And actually, it's from a story that you probably know. If you know the story of Joseph, was imprisoned in Egypt and ended up essentially as the prime minister of the country. Then he brought his whole family over, and several generations after that, I don't know if you can hear the purring. Several generations after that, he brought his after he had died, the people of Egypt turned against the Israelites. So I'm going to read you a little bit about that. Now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and, if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. Heavy burdens. That's to do with work. That was their working life. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramesses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this? And let the male children live." The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall save every daughter." Okay, so here we've got a situation where the Egyptians are, the Israelites are slaves. And more than that, the king of Egypt wants to kill them. And we might call this, in terms of healthcare, a protocol. And for those of you who are paying attention during lockdowns, there were protocols. So this is a protocol that is specific to the Hebrew boys. Okay, now I'm going to tell you that I'm going to read a verse from later on in Exodus, because there are several verses just like this that are explicitly saying that the Israelites in Egypt were slaves. So this is Exodus 13, verse 3. Then Moses said to the people, "Remember this in the day which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery. For by a strong hand the Lord brought you out from this place." There are lots of verses that talk about the Israelites being in slavery in Egypt. So this was not private slavery where one person owned another, but more like state slavery, where the individual is the slave, or the individuals are the slaves, and the state is the owner. And so my question then to you, is this possible? Is this a scenario that we might recognise today? Well, let's think about an ordinary person and think about work and earnings, because this is slavery as we have looked in the dictionary, and as we have looked in these verses in the Bible. It is to do with work. So my first question then would be, in terms of your earnings, if you're working, or in terms of your earnings, your family earnings, do you get the first cut? No, you don't. Because the first cut goes to the state as tax. And then when you die and you want to leave an inheritance to your children, do your children get the first cut? No, they don't. The state does. And what about your home? Well, here's the thing, that in order to live in your own home, you have to pay tax. And that suggests, or that begs the question, if you need to pay tax in order to live in a specific place, do you really own your own home? And then let's think about our purchasing power when we buy. The first cut in terms of VAT goes to the government, and especially that is true with fuel, which again fuel is important as a route to freedom in terms of travel, but the biggest cut, or a large cut of that, the first cut, goes to the government in tax. Then let's think, we'll move away from tax, from money, and think about regulations. So we're a highly regulated nation, and for many things that we do, we actually need government approval. We need government approval to drive, and you could say that there are arguments for and against that. You want to know that the other people on the road can drive safely. That is true, but on the other hand, is it the government that should be approving? Perhaps we could think about private companies that issue driving licenses, and you might think, yeah, but if it's private, then it's open to corruption. Well, let's think about who is in the government and ask ourselves, are these people open to corruption? Okay, we need approval to own certain animals. I've got cats, you've seen them. I don't need government approval for those, but I think you need government approval for dogs. You certainly do for birds. There was a big thing about that recently. And in many situations, you need government approval to start up a business that sells things, especially if there are things to eat or to drink. And depending on what it is exactly you're selling, these regulations can be quite onerous. Many trades and professions need government approval. Teaching, my profession, yes, you need government approval in order to do that. In fact, I had a colleague who, through no fault of his own, his registration or government approval had lapsed, and there was some paperwork involved, bureaucracy. in order to reinstate his government approval. And for 3 or 4 days in the classroom, he had to have an approved person sitting in the classroom with him, watching him teach. It wasn't a teacher. It was just somebody that the government, the state, had approved that had to sit in the classroom with him. So, and then let's think about hate speech laws. Now, people think of hate speech laws. There's certain people with certain characteristics that you're not allowed to criticize. But actually, that's not what the issue here is. It's not about those individuals or those groups. It's actually about state ideology. And the reason I say that is because these groups, these favoured groups, can change. And actually, we're seeing them changing. In front of our eyes, we're seeing things change about who can be guilty of hate crimes and who can't, who can be victims of hate crimes and who can't. That is changing before our eyes. So it's not about specific groups, it's actually about state ideology. And these are essentially, hate speech laws are essentially blasphemy laws, but blasphemy against the state, not against particular groups or individuals. So, that leads to the question, are we slaves? And I would argue that, to an extent, we are. And depending on what your job is, or whether you're getting benefits, how much you use state services, indicates how much of a slave you are. So if you're using a lot of state services, which are free, i.e. they're paid for with tax money, the taxes that we've already covered, they're not free at all because they're quite onerous, the taxes. So the more you interact with state services, the closer you are to slavery. And if you work for the state, then again, closer to slavery. So, of course, then the next question is, what do we do? How can we be free? How can we get extricated from our slave owners? So that is something that we're going to look at next week. Okay. So, home education and slavery. I haven't yet really mentioned home education, but you can imagine, I'm sure in your mind you're already thinking, okay, I can see where she's going to go with this. So, next week we will look at what we can do in terms of state slavery. Okay, thanks a lot, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.